In one of the most powerful civilizations the ancient world had ever seen, every pharaoh who had ever sat upon the throne of Egypt shared one thing in common. They were all men. The walls of every temple said so. The gods themselves, Egyptians believed, demanded it. And then, in the middle of the 15th century BC, a woman looked at 3,000 years of tradition and decided it no longer applied to her. Her name was Hatshepsut, and the story of how she did it and what happened after is one of the most extraordinary political maneuvers in all of recorded history. Around 1,550 years BC, Egypt entered the most glorious chapter of its long and storied history. For over a century, the Nile Delta had been occupied by a foreign people called the Hyksos, chariot-riding invaders from the Levant who had seized northern Egypt and ruled it as their own. It was Pharaoh Ahmose I who finally broke their grip, driving them out and reunifying the two lands under a single Egyptian crown. That victory did not merely end an occupation, it launched a new era. Egyptologists call it the New Kingdom. Historians call it the apex of ancient Egyptian civilization, and the dynasty Ahmose founded, the 18th dynasty, would go on to produce some of the most celebrated rulers the world has ever known. Among them, one would stand apart from all the rest. Ahmose's great-granddaughter, it's a woman named Hatshepsut, a name that translates from the ancient Egyptian as foremost of noble ladies, would not only reign over this golden empire, she would reshape it. Inscriptions at Karnak credit her with trade missions that brought the riches of distant lands to Egyptian shores for the first time in generations. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, rising in 3 colonnaded terraces from the desert cliffs of western Thebes, remains one of the most architecturally sophisticated structures ever built in the ancient world. And she accomplished all of this while navigating a court that had never once, in its entire history, been designed for a woman to lead. Hatshepsut was born around 1508 BC to Pharaoh Thutmose I and his great royal wife, Queen Ahmose, from her very first breath, and she entered one of the most politically charged environments on earth, the royal court at Thebes, the glittering capital of New Kingdom Egypt. She was not born into obscurity and then thrust into greatness. She was born at the centre of power itself. Her father, Thutmose I, was not merely a king, he was a conqueror. Records show that his military campaigns pushed Egypt's borders further than they had ever reached, driving south into Nubia, beyond the fourth cataract of the Nile, and north into Syria, where inscriptions describe his army planting a victory stele on the banks of the Euphrates. Egypt, under his rule, was an empire in the fullest sense of the word. Hatshepsut grew up inside all of this. She was educated in the disciplines expected of the royal court: temple ritual, administrative governance, religious doctrine, and diplomacy. Crucially, her father appointed her to one of the most powerful religious offices available to a woman in Egypt, the role of God's wife of Amun. This was not a ceremonial title. It carried real authority within the temple complex at Karnak, giving the young Hatshepsut direct influence over the priesthood that controlled Egypt's most important religious institution and its considerable wealth. She was, in every sense, being prepared for a life of consequence. She was also, records suggest, surrounded by siblings who did not survive. Chronologies indicate that Hatshepsut had at least one sister and 2 brothers, all of whom died before reaching adulthood. The royal nurseries of ancient Egypt were unforgiving places, and disease, accidents, and the brutal arithmetic of infant mortality claimed heirs with regularity. But by the time Thutmose I began contemplating his own succession, Hatshepsut, his only surviving child by his great royal wife, had become something invaluable, the sole living vessel of pure royal blood. That fact would define the next chapter of her life entirely. When Thutmose I died, the throne passed to his son, Thutmose II, but this was not a straightforward succession. Thutmose II was born not to the great royal wife Ahmose, but to a lesser wife of the court. In the carefully maintained hierarchy of Egyptian royal blood, this made him technically inferior in lineage. To rule without challenge, he needed legitimacy that his own birth could not provide. The solution Egypt had long used in such moments was marriage, and there was only one woman in the palace whose bloodline was beyond question. Hatshepsut, approximately 12 years old at the time, became the wife of her half-brother, and in doing so became Queen of Egypt. It was a political arrangement as cold and precise as any military calculation, but within its architecture, Hatshepsut had been handed something she would one day use in ways no one at court could have predicted. The stage was now set, a golden empire at the height of its power, a queen of impeccable blood sitting beside a king of uncertain health, and somewhere in the balance between tradition and ambition, a question that Egypt had never once had to answer, until now. What happens when the most qualified person in the kingdom is a woman? The death of Thutmose I did not plunge Egypt into chaos, but it came closer than the official records would ever admit. Succession in the ancient Egyptian royal court was never as clean as the propaganda carved into temple walls suggested. The throne did not simply pass from father to son in an unbroken line of divine inevitability. It passed through negotiation, through blood calculation, and, most critically, through marriage. When Thutmose I died, the man positioned to inherit the two lands was his son Thutmose II. On paper, the transition looked orderly. Beneath the surface, it was anything but. Thutmose II had a problem that no military campaign could solve. He was the son of a lesser wife, not of the great royal wife Ahmose, whose bloodline carried the full weight of dynastic legitimacy. In the logic of Egyptian kingship, blood was not merely a biological fact, it was a theological argument. A pharaoh's right to rule was inseparable from the purity of his lineage. A king without an unimpeachable royal bloodline was a king whose authority could be questioned by rivals, by priests, by anyone with ambition and an audience. Thutmose II could not afford that vulnerability. The solution was standing right beside him. Hatshepsut, approximately 12 years old at the time of her father's death, possessed everything her half-brother lacked. She was the daughter of both Thutmose I and his great royal wife Ahmose, the purest royal blood available in Egypt. By marrying her, Thutmose II did not merely take a wife, he borrowed her legitimacy. He wrapped his reign in her lineage and presented the union to the court, the priesthood, and the gods as proof that the throne remained in rightful hands. Yes, the marriage was less a personal arrangement than a political instrument, and both parties understood exactly what it was. What it gave Hatshepsut, however, was something the arrangement had not necessarily intended to give her: proximity to the centre of everything. As great royal wife, she held the highest position available to a woman in Egypt. She managed the royal household. She participated in temple ceremonies with direct influence over religious life at Karnak. building on the authority she had already accumulated as God's wife of Amun. Inscriptions from the period show her name appearing alongside her husband's in official contexts, not as a footnote, but as a presence. She was not merely decorating the throne room, she was operating within it. Together, Hatshepsut and Thutmose II had one child, a daughter named Neferura. She was raised with the full attention of the royal court, tutored, dressed in the regalia of her station, and positioned as a significant figure in the royal family. But in a system that required a male heir to continue the dynastic line, a daughter alone was not enough. Thutmose II turned to a secondary wife, a woman named Iset, and she gave him a son. The boy was named Thutmose, and he became the designated heir to the throne of Egypt. He would later be known to history as Thutmose III. That child's existence solved one problem for the dynasty. It also, quietly, began creating another. Thutmose II's reign lasted somewhere between 3 and 13 years. Egyptologists continued to debate the precise figure, and the historical record from this period is frustratingly incomplete. What is not in dispute is that he died young. Ancient sources and physical examination of his mummy suggest a man in poor health, his body showing signs of disease. He was likely in his late 20s or early 30s when he died. He had ruled long enough to maintain the empire his father had built, but not long enough to consolidate it on his own terms. When he died, his heir, the child Thutmose III, was approximately 3 years old. 3 years old. Egypt, the wealthiest and most powerful nation in the known world, with borders stretching from the fourth cataract of the Nile to the edges of the Levant, with a military, a priesthood, a vast administrative apparatus, and enemies watching its every move from every direction. That empire now had a toddler as its pharaoh. Someone had to hold it together. There was, in truth, only one person in the palace with the bloodline, the religious authority, the administrative experience, and the political standing to step into that void. She had spent her entire life, whether by design or fortune, becoming exactly that person. Hatshepsut became Queen Regent, and Egypt would never quite be the same again. The coronation of Thutmose III was, by every external measure, a moment of continuity. The rituals were performed. The double crown was placed. The priests invoked the gods. Egypt had a pharaoh. He was 3 years old. In practice, and a child on the throne meant that someone else was making every decision that kept the empire functioning. Every diplomatic correspondence dispatched to foreign courts, every temple offering coordinated across the Nile Valley, every administrative decree that moved grain, settled disputes, and maintained the vast machinery of Egyptian governance. That someone was Hatshepsut. Her official title was Queen Regent, a role the Egyptian court understood well enough. A regent was a caretaker, a temporary steward who held things together until the rightful ruler came of age. The title implied limitation. It implied patience. It implied, above all, that power was being borrowed, not owned. Hatshepsut appears to have understood the title differently. From the earliest days of the regency, her inscriptions and administrative records show her operating not as a passive placeholder, but as an active head of state. She managed the royal court at Thebes with the full weight of executive authority. Foreign delegations were received, trade relationships were maintained, and, in some cases, expanded. Temple construction projects, the constant, ceaseless architectural ambition that defined every serious Egyptian reign. continued under her direct oversight. The bureaucratic engine of Egypt did not slow down. It kept moving, and she was the one driving it. What made this possible was not merely her title. It was the coalition she had spent years, perhaps unknowingly, assembling around herself. The priesthood of Amun was the single most powerful religious institution in Egypt, and Hatshepsut had cultivated her relationship with it carefully. Her role as God's wife of Amun had given her standing within the temple complex at Karnak long before she became regent. The priests who managed Egypt's most important religious and economic institution, Karnak's temples controlled enormous tracts of land and vast stores of wealth, had every reason to support a regent who understood their world and respected their authority. Their endorsement was not merely spiritual. In ancient Egypt, a ruler backed by the priesthood of Amun was a ruler backed by institutional Egypt itself. Beyond the temple, Hatshepsut worked to secure the loyalty of the noble class. The powerful administrators, regional governors, and court officials whose cooperation was essential to keeping a large and complex empire from fracturing at its edges. And these were practical men who cared less about precedent and more about stability. A capable regent who kept the Nile flowing, the borders secure, and the grain moving was worth more to them than any abstract argument about gender and tradition. Hatshepsut gave them competence, and competence brought loyalty. The military too remained aligned. Egypt's army had not suddenly become ungovernable simply because its pharaoh was a child. The institutional structure held, and Hatshepsut's careful management of its leadership, maintaining its prestige, directing its resources, keeping it engaged, ensured that no general found cause to look elsewhere for a patron. And then there was Senenmut. He appears in the historical record as one of the most remarkable figures of the entire 18th dynasty, a man of non-royal birth who rose, and through talent and proximity to power, to become one of the most influential officials in Egypt. His titles were numerous: overseer of royal works, steward of Amun, overseer of the granary. He was also appointed tutor to Princess Neferura, placing him at the intimate centre of the royal household. The monuments he oversaw, the organisational genius he applied to Hatshepsut's building programmes, and the sheer breadth of his responsibilities suggest a man trusted not just professionally, but personally. Speculation has followed Senenmut across the centuries. Ancient graffiti found near Deir el-Bahari, crude drawings depicting a figure in a regent's crown in a compromising position, suggests that even his contemporaries whispered about the nature of his relationship with Hatshepsut. But whether those whispers reflected reality, or were simply the predictable gossip of a court watching a powerful woman rely heavily on a powerful man, history cannot confirm. What it can confirm is that he was indispensable, and that Hatshepsut kept him close. By the time 7 years had passed since the death of Thutmose II, something had become undeniable, not just to those watching from the outside, but to Hatshepsut herself. Egypt was not waiting for its pharaoh to grow up. Egypt was already being governed, the decisions were being made, the campaigns directed, the temples built, the trade routes managed. The empire was running, and she was running it. The title of regent described a woman holding a throne in trust, but the reality described something else entirely. I notice you've skipped chapter 3 and jumped to chapter 4. And I'll write chapter 4 maintaining narrative continuity from chapter 2, but just flag. You'll want to slot chapter 3 in before this one when assembling the full script, since it covers the regency period that this chapter builds directly on. 7 years is a long time to hold an empire together in someone else's name. By the time Hatshepsut had served as Queen Regent for the better part of a decade, the political landscape of Egypt bore her fingerprints on virtually every surface. She had managed diplomatic correspondence with foreign courts. She had overseen the administration of the Nile's agricultural cycles, the lifeblood of Egyptian taxation and food supply. She had maintained the goodwill of the priesthood at Karnak, the most institutionally powerful religious body in the country. She had, in every practical sense, been running Egypt while a child sat on the throne and the world watched to see how long the arrangement would hold. At some point around 1473 BC, Hatshepsut decided the arrangement was over. The exact circumstances of her declaration remain one of the more tantalizing gaps in the historical record. There was no battle, no coup in the conventional sense, no blood on the palace floors. Chronologies indicate that the transition happened through official channels, which is perhaps the most remarkable thing about it. Hatshepsut did not take the throne by force. She took it by procedure. She moved through the mechanisms of Egyptian statecraft with such precision that, by the time the full weight of what she had done became visible, it was already done. She declared herself Pharaoh of Egypt. She assumed the full suite of royal titles that had, for centuries, been the exclusive domain of men. She took a throne name, Mat-Kare, meaning truth is the soul of Ra, a name that placed her directly within the divine order of the universe, binding her rule to the cosmic principle of Ma'at, the foundational Egyptian concept of truth, balance, and righteous order. It was a name chosen with precision, not vanity. In Egyptian theology, a pharaoh who embodied Ma'at was not merely a good ruler, they were a necessary one. The cosmos itself, Egyptians believed, depended on the pharaoh maintaining that balance. By naming herself Mat-Kare, Hatshepsut was not simply claiming a throne, she was claiming a cosmic function. Official records were updated, inscriptions were commissioned, documents began to carry her name not as regent, and not as queen, but as king. The double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the Hedjet and the Deshret, white and red, the two lands unified, was now, at least in every formal and administrative sense, hers. Thutmose III did not disappear. He remained co-ruler, and his name continued to appear in official contexts alongside hers. On the surface, the arrangement could be read as a continuation of the regency, an older, more experienced figure governing alongside a younger one. But the political reality was something else entirely. Thutmose III, now perhaps 10 years old, held his title. Hatshepsut held the power. He was assigned a role within the military structure, a position of nominal prestige that kept him occupied and visible without placing him anywhere near the levers of actual governance. For the duration of what followed, he would remain a co-ruler in name while she directed the empire in practice. It is worth pausing on how genuinely unprecedented this was. Egypt had a long memory. Its civilization stretched back more than 1,500 years before Hatshepsut was born, and across all of that recorded history, the institution of the pharaoh had been defined, depicted, and theologically justified as male. The very iconography of kingship, the crook and flail, the double crown, the false beard worn in ceremonies, was gendered. Temple reliefs showed the pharaoh as a man receiving divine favour from male gods. The language of kingship was masculine. The entire symbolic architecture of Egyptian royal authority had been constructed, generation by generation, to reinforce the assumption that the person at its centre would always be a man. Hatshepsut stepped into the centre of that architecture anyway. She did not dismantle it. She did not reject it. She wore it. The false beard would appear on her statues. The masculine royal kilt would frame her image on temple walls. The titles, the cartouches, the ceremonial language of kingship, all of it was adopted, adapted, and deployed with the confidence of someone who understood that legitimacy in Egypt was not simply inherited. It was performed, constructed, and above all, believed. For the first time in centuries, Egypt was ruled by a woman wearing the crown of a king. And she had only just begun. Declaring yourself Pharaoh was one thing. Making Egypt believe it was another entirely. Hatshepsut understood something that every durable political regime throughout history has understood, that raw authority on its own is fragile. It can be challenged, resented, outlasted. What cannot be easily challenged is authority that has been woven into the fabric of something larger than any individual, into religion, into myth, into the story a civilization tells about itself. To rule Egypt without question, Hatshepsut did not just need political support, she needed the gods on her side. And so she built the case, systematically, brilliantly, and in stone. The centrepiece of her legitimacy campaign was what scholars now call the divine birth narrative, and it was carved directly into the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari for all of Egypt to witness. The story the reliefs tell is this. The god Amun, king of the gods and supreme deity of the Egyptian pantheon, did not simply bless Hatshepsut's rule from a distance. According to the inscriptions she commissioned, he had been its architect from the very beginning. Reliefs describe Amun taking the form of Thutmose I and visiting Queen Ahmose in the royal chambers. The god himself, the story declares, had fathered Hatshepsut. Her conception was not a human event, it was a divine one. She was not merely the daughter of a pharaoh, she was the daughter of a god, chosen before her birth to sit upon Egypt's throne. The theological implication was airtight. If Amun himself had ordained her reign, then opposing it was not a political act. It was a religious one. It was, in the language of Egyptian belief, a disruption of Ma'at, the very cosmic order that Egyptian society existed to maintain. Her Hatshepsut had taken the central anxiety about her rule, that a woman had no business being king, and transformed it into a question that cut in the opposite direction. Who exactly would dare argue with Amun? This narrative did not exist in isolation. It was supported, sustained, and amplified by the most powerful religious institution in Egypt, the Temple of Amun at Karnak. The priesthood of Amun had long been one of the most politically influential forces in the country, controlling enormous tracts of land, vast material wealth, and the spiritual authority that came with managing Egypt's most important religious complex. Hatshepsut had cultivated that relationship carefully, and the priesthood's endorsement of her rule carried a weight that no military appointment or administrative title could replicate. When Karnak spoke, Egypt listened, but Hatshepsut's propaganda operation extended well beyond theology. It worked on the visual plane with equal sophistication across statues, reliefs, and temple carvings commissioned throughout her reign. Hatshepsut was depicted not as a woman who had assumed a king's role, but as a king. Full stop. She wore the ceremonial false beard, the narrow strip of braided material that hung from the chin, and served as one of the most recognizable symbols of pharaonic authority. Her body, in official imagery, was rendered with the broad shoulders, defined musculature and upright posture of a male ruler. She wore the pharaoh's kilt. She carried the crook and flail. In image after image, repeated across the length and breadth of Egypt, the visual language was unambiguous. This was a king. Her inscription campaigns reinforced the message at every scale. Her throne name, Mat-Kare, appeared in cartouches on temple pylons, on obelisks, on offering tables and administrative documents. Chronologies indicate that her name was systematically integrated into official records across both Upper and Lower Egypt, replacing or supplementing references to her as regent with the full royal titulary of a reigning pharaoh. The campaign was not modest, it was comprehensive. The cumulative effect of all of this, the divine birth story, the priestly endorsement, the male iconography, the inscription campaigns, was a political identity so thoroughly constructed that it functioned as reality. Egypt did not simply tolerate Hatshepsut as pharaoh, it recognized her as one. She was no longer the woman who had stepped into the role. As she was Mat-Kare Hatshepsut, pharaoh of Upper and Lower Egypt, daughter of Amun, chosen of the gods. The queen had become a king in every way that Egypt knew how to measure. Having secured her throne through bloodline, religion and imagery, Hatshepsut now turned to the question that defined every pharaoh's legacy. Not just how you held power, but what you did with it. Her answer would become one of the most celebrated achievements in the 3,000-year history of ancient Egypt. For generations before Hatshepsut's reign, Egypt had maintained a tantalizing awareness of a place called Punt. It appeared in older texts as a land of extraordinary wealth, a source of frankincense, myrrh, gold and exotic goods that Egyptian traders had once brought back along the Red Sea corridor, but contact had been broken, and no Egyptian expedition had successfully reached Punt in over 500 years. The routes had grown unfamiliar, the logistics daunting, and the intervening reigns had been focused primarily on military campaigns rather than commercial ones. Punt had faded from an active trading partner into something closer to legend, a place Egypt knew existed but could no longer quite reach. Hatshepsut reached it. Around the 9th year of her reign, she dispatched a fleet of 5 large sailing vessels southward from the Red Sea port of Sorwadu. These were not small exploratory crafts. Records show they were purpose-built for the voyage. Broad, shallow-hulled ships capable of carrying substantial cargo, crewed by sailors, soldiers and royal envoys carrying gifts and trading goods. The mission scale reflected its ambition. This was not a scouting expedition, it was a statement. Punt's precise location has never been conclusively identified, and the debate among archaeologists and historians remains active. Inscriptions from Deir el-Bahari describe a land of coastal settlements built on stilts above the water, surrounded by vegetation and inhabited by people Egyptian artists depicted with distinctive physical features. The geography of the region, combined with the goods the expedition returned with, places Punt most plausibly somewhere along the Horn of Africa, modern-day Somalia, Eritrea, or possibly the Djibouti coastline. Wherever it was far, and getting there required both navigational skill and considerable nerve. The fleet returned laden in a way that would have staggered the court at Thebes. Among the cargo, gold, and measured in rings and in dust, ivory tusks, raw ebony, 31 living myrrh trees, their roots carefully packed in soil-filled baskets for the voyage home, a feat of botanical logistics that had never been attempted before in recorded history. Hatshepsut became the first ruler known to have successfully transplanted living trees from a foreign land, and those myrrh trees were subsequently planted in the terraced gardens of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, where inscriptions describe them taking root in Egyptian soil. Cargoes of dried frankincense and myrrh resin arrived alongside them, both substances of immense religious and commercial value used in temple rituals throughout Egypt. Fresh supplies of these incenses were, for the priesthood at Karnak, not a luxury, they were a necessity. And Hatshepsut had just solved a supply problem that had persisted for generations. The animals that came back aboard those ships caused what must have been an extraordinary spectacle on the Nile docks. Inscriptions and wall paintings at Deir el-Bahari record the arrival of baboons, a giraffe, leopards and dogs of exotic breeds, creatures that Egyptians associated with the wild, sacred periphery of the known world. The giraffe alone, towering over the dock workers who led it ashore, would have been like nothing the court at Thebes had seen in living memory. Every detail of the expedition was recorded on the walls of Hatshepsut's mortuary temple in a visual narrative that runs across multiple registers: ships on the water, the settlement at Punt, the exchange of gifts, the loading of cargo, the voyage home. It is one of the most detailed accounts of any trading mission in all of ancient Egyptian art, and Hatshepsut made certain it would be seen. This was not merely documentation, it was advertisement. The expedition accomplished something that no military victory could have delivered in quite the same way. It demonstrated that Egypt's reach under Hatshepsut extended to the edges of the known world, not through the destruction of conquest, but through the ambition of exploration and the discipline of commerce. Power, her reign was proving, did not require a battlefield. It required vision, and she had it in abundance. Trade had filled Egypt's coffers. Propaganda had secured her image. Now Hatshepsut turned to the medium that every great pharaoh before her had understood as the ultimate measure of a reign: stone. In ancient Egypt, what building was not simply construction, it was theology made physical. Every temple raised in a god's honour was an act of devotion that simultaneously demonstrated the pharaoh's divine favour. Every monument that bore a ruler's name was an argument, carved into granite, that this person had mattered, that the gods had smiled, that Egypt had prospered, that the reign had been righteous. To build on a grand scale was to make a claim on eternity. Hatshepsut made that claim on a scale that left her contemporaries and every subsequent generation struggling to match it. Chronologies indicate that she commissioned construction projects at more than 20 sites across both Upper and Lower Egypt. A building campaign of sustained ambition that touched virtually every major religious centre in the country. Shrines, chapels, pylons, and ceremonial way stations were erected or expanded from the delta in the north to the furthest reaches of Upper Egypt in the south. No corner of the kingdom was left without some visible mark of her reign. But it was at Karnak where her architectural ambition announced itself most loudly. The Temple of Amun at Karnak was already, in Hatshepsut's time, one of the largest and most elaborately developed religious complexes in the world. Generations of pharaohs had added to it, each trying to outdo the last. Hatshepsut did not merely add to it, she transformed it. Her most striking contribution was a pair of obelisks, enormous monolithic shafts of pink Aswan granite, each standing at approximately 29 metres tall, making them among the tallest structures in Egypt at the time of their erection. Both were dedicated to Amun, their surfaces covered in electrum, an alloy of gold and silver, so that when the sun struck them at the right angle, they blazed like pillars of fire visible for miles across the Theban plain. Inscriptions on the base of the surviving obelisk record that Hatshepsut ordered the work completed in a period of approximately 7 months, a logistical achievement that staggers modern engineers who have studied the quarrying, transport, and raising of such structures. One of those obelisks still stands. It remains the tallest surviving ancient obelisk in Egypt. The other fell at some point in antiquity and now lies broken on the temple grounds. Its fall a quiet reminder that even the most permanent-seeming things are subject to time. Hatshepsut ordered a third obelisk, even larger than the pair at Karnak's entrance. The project was abandoned when cracks formed in the granite during quarrying at Aswan. That abandoned shaft, known today as the unfinished obelisk, never left the quarry floor. It lies there still, partially carved from the bedrock, attached on its lower face to the living rock from which it was never fully separated. What it lacks in completion, it more than compensates for in historical value. The chisel marks of workers dead for 3,500 years remain clearly visible along its surface. Ochre-coloured guidelines, drawn to direct the stonecutters, have survived in the dry Aswan air. Layers of evidence preserved in the stone reveal the precise techniques Egyptian workers used to separate granite from the earth, a process that, even incomplete, represents one of the most illuminating archaeological records of ancient construction methods anywhere in the world. And then there was Djeser Djeseru. The name means Holy of Holies, and the structure built at Deir el-Bahari on the west bank of the Nile earns every syllable of it. Hatshepsut's mortuary temple rises from the desert floor in 3 broad colonnaded terraces, each level connected by ramps. The whole structure framed against the sheer golden limestone cliffs of the Theban hills behind it. It was designed by her chief official, Senemut, and it represented a complete departure from the enclosed, dark, fortress-like temples that preceded it. Open, luminous, geometric, its long rows of square columns creating rhythms of light and shadow that seem almost architectural in a modern sense. It still stands. Tourists walk through it today. No pharaoh who came after Hatshepsut ever built anything that surpassed it. Her name was on the walls of temples from one end of Egypt to the other. Her obelisks caught the sun above Karnak. Her terraced temple rose from the cliffs of Deir el-Bahari like something the desert itself had decided to offer up. It seemed, in every conceivable way, like a legacy that could not be touched. Or so it seemed. Around 1458 BC, after more than 20 years on the throne of Egypt, Hatshepsut died. The empire she left behind was, by any measure, stronger than the one she had inherited. Its trade networks reached further. Its temple complexes were grander. Its administrative machinery had been refined under 2 decades of her direct oversight. She had ruled longer than many of the male pharaohs history remembers far more readily, and she had done it without a single recorded military defeat, without a civil war, and without the kind of court fractures that had destabilized other reigns. By the cold accounting of outcomes, her reign was a success. Thutmose III, now a grown man and a seasoned military commander, having spent years leading Egypt's armies in campaigns that Hatshepsut had deliberately kept him occupied with, finally stepped into sole control of the throne he had nominally shared since childhood. He would go on to become one of Egypt's greatest warrior pharaohs, pushing the empire's borders to their furthest extent and earning comparisons in later centuries to Alexander the Great. His record as a ruler stands on its own terms. He needed nothing from Hatshepsut's legacy to justify his own, which is precisely what makes what happened next so difficult to explain. At some point during Thutmose III's reign, not immediately after Hatshepsut's death, but years later, possibly decades, a systematic campaign began. Workers moved through the temples and monuments of Egypt with tools and intent. Hatshepsut's face was chiselled from stone. Her name was excised from cartouches, the oval frames that identified a royal name in hieroglyphic inscriptions, and replaced, sometimes with the name of Thutmose III, sometimes with that of his father Thutmose II, sometimes left blank. Her statues were pulled down, smashed and buried in pits near Deir el-Bahari. The visual record of her reign, the reliefs, the inscriptions, and the portrait images that had been installed across 20 plus years of building campaigns, was systematically targeted, not entirely erased. The work was thorough in some places and incomplete in others, suggesting either that the campaign was never fully finished or that it was never intended to be absolute, but the intention behind it seems clear enough. Someone wanted Hatshepsut removed from the official story of Egypt's kings. The question of who gave the order and why has occupied Egyptologists for well over a century, and the honest answer is that the historical record does not provide certainty. What it does provide is a set of competing theories, each with its own logic and its own limitations. The most emotionally satisfying explanation, that Thutmose III ordered the erasure out of personal resentment, a payback for the years he had spent sidelined while Hatshepsut ruled, has largely fallen out of favour among serious scholars. The timing argues against it. Inscriptions show that the defacement did not begin immediately after her death. Records show a gap of roughly 20 years between her death and the first evidence of systematic image destruction. A man acting from personal grievance does not typically wait 2 decades to act on it. A more persuasive theory centres on dynastic succession. By the later years of Thutmose III's reign, his son Amenhotep II was being prepared to inherit the throne. Amenhotep had no blood connection to Hatshepsut's royal line. His legitimacy derived entirely from his father. Some Egyptologists argue that the erasure was a forward-looking political calculation. By removing Hatshepsut from the official king list and reassigning her regnal years to the male pharaohs who bracketed her reign, the dynasty could present an unbroken line of male succession that would strengthen Amenhotep's claim and eliminate any precedent that a future claimant might invoke. There is also the broader cultural argument that a successful female pharaoh was, from a patriarchal administrative standpoint, an inconvenience the system preferred not to acknowledge. Inscriptions suggest that some in the priesthood regarded the concept of a ruling queen as a disruption of Ma'at itself, the same cosmic order Hatshepsut had invoked to justify her own rule. Allowing her reign to stand openly in the record might, the thinking went, invite repetition. Whatever the motivation, political calculation, dynastic housekeeping, or institutional discomfort, the campaign left its mark. Her name disappeared from king lists, her images vanished from public walls. Later generations of Egyptians, reading the official record of their own history, would have found no trace of her. For centuries it appeared the effort had worked. The queen who had become king had been, as far as the world could tell, erased entirely from history. The people who tried to erase Hatshepsut made one critical miscalculation. They destroyed her images. They chiselled out her name. They buried her statues and reassigned her years to other kings. But they could not destroy her buildings, and buildings, it turns out, have a way of outlasting the intentions of the people who tried to silence them. But for roughly 3,000 years, Hatshepsut existed at the margins of history, a ghost in the official record, her reign attributed to others, her name absent from the king lists that later dynasties used to trace the lineage of Egyptian power. When ancient historians compiled their accounts of Egypt's rulers, she was not there. When classical writers visited the monuments of the Nile Valley, they admired structures they could not correctly attribute. The mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari stood in the desert cliffs of western Thebes through every century of that silence, visited, wondered at, partially buried by sand and debris, its walls still carrying the reliefs that told the story of a pharaoh the official record had decided to forget. The process of recovering her began slowly in the 19th century, and as European archaeologists turned their attention to the Theban necropolis with increasing seriousness, the temple at Deir el-Bahari had never been entirely unknown. Its scale made it impossible to miss, but the identity of its builder remained uncertain, its inscriptions damaged, its statuary absent. Excavations at the site, most significantly those carried out by the Egypt Exploration Fund in the 1890s under the direction of Edouard Neville, began to reveal the full extent of what lay beneath the accumulated debris of centuries. Wall reliefs emerged from the sand, inscriptions were cleaned and read, the divine birth narrative, the Punt expedition panels, the cartouches of Matkare, layer by layer, the temple gave back what had been hidden. Then, in 1903, the American archaeologist Herbert Winlock, working in the debris field below the temple's upper terrace, made a discovery that reframed everything. Buried in a pit, deliberately smashed and deposited there, their faces and inscriptions deliberately defaced, were hundreds of statues, sphinxes, kneeling figures, seated portraits, osiride statues in the style of royal mortuary imagery. They had been removed from the temple with intent, but whoever had ordered their removal had not taken them far. Layers of evidence preserved in the pit revealed that the statues had been broken and buried on site, as if the goal had been removal from visibility rather than total annihilation. Winlock and his team excavated and catalogued the fragments over years of painstaking work. When they were eventually reconstructed and assembled, a process that continued well into the 20th century, the faces that emerged from the damaged stone were unmistakably those of the same ruler, depicted again and again in the full regalia of a pharaoh. The woman on those statues was Hatshepsut, and now for the first time in 3 millennia she had a face again. But the most dramatic chapter of her rediscovery was still to come. For decades, her mummy remained unidentified. Egyptologists knew that she had been buried, originally at least, in the Valley of the Kings, in a tomb she had commissioned first for herself as queen and later expanded when she became pharaoh. That tomb, designated KV-20, had been excavated, but the mummies found inside had not been conclusively identified. A second, an unidentified female mummy, had been discovered in a separate cache tomb, KV-60, lying alongside the mummy of a royal wet nurse named Sitre In. For years, this second mummy attracted little attention. In 2006, Egyptologist Zahi Hawass led a project to resolve the question using modern forensic technology. CT scanning was applied to both the mummies in KV60 and to a wooden box bearing Hatshepsut's royal cartouche that had been found in her tomb. A box that contained, among other objects, a single molar tooth. The CT scan of the unidentified mummy revealed a missing tooth in its upper jaw. The root and dimensions of the loose molar from Hatshepsut's canopic box matched the gap in the mummy's jaw with a precision that forensic analysts found conclusive. And the woman who had lain unidentified in a side chamber of KV60 for over a century was Hatshepsut. Further analysis confirmed that she had died at approximately 50 years of age. Examination of her remains revealed evidence of bone cancer, a metastatic disease that would have caused significant suffering in her final years. Some researchers have also pointed to the contents of a cosmetic jar bearing her name, found among her burial goods, which contained a carcinogenic compound consistent with a skin lotion or medicinal preparation. Whether the substance contributed to her illness remains debated, but the physical evidence of the cancer itself is not. She had ruled for more than 20 years. She had built an empire's worth of monuments. She had sent fleets to the edge of the known world and brought back its riches. As she had stared down 3,000 years of tradition and replaced it for 2 decades with something more complicated and more human, the simple fact of her own competence. Historians today recognise her not as a footnote or a curiosity, but as one of the most effective rulers in Egyptian history, a master of statecraft, a visionary builder, and a political strategist whose moves, made in the 15th century BC, still reward study. The erasure failed, the stone endured, the tooth matched. Hatshepsut, the queen who became pharaoh and ruled like a king, was never really gone. She was only waiting to be found.